I'm Rachel Morgan. I'm 27 years old, and the night my sister walked down the aisle in a gown that cost more than my car, she pretended not to know the man who paid for every inch of it. 350 guests rose to their feet as Jessica drifted past rows of flowers and crystal camera flashes popping like fireworks under the chandeliers. At the very back, in an old gray suit he'd worn to graduations and birthdays, my grandfather, Walter, pushed himself up from his chair, his hands shaking just a little. He smiled at her, the way he always had, with that quiet, steady pride that never needed an audience. And then, with all of Boston's best people watching, my sister looked him in the eye and called him sir, as if he were one of the staff who had wandered too close. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments, and if you've ever watched someone choose status over family, hit that like and subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. From the outside that evening at Reed Crest Vineyard Resort looked like something out of a glossy magazine, the kind you flip through in a waiting room and assume no real person actually lives that way. The driveway curved through rows of late summer vines, fairy lights strung between them like low stars, and black town cars lined up beneath the stone archway that carried my grandfather's last name. Inside the lobby smelled like fresh flowers and polished wood, the string quartet warming up beneath a glass ceiling that reflected every bit of crystal and gold. People kept calling it the event of the season, the kind of wedding that would be whispered about at charity galas and country club brunches. I stood just off to the side of the ballroom doors, in a navy dress I'd saved 3 paychecks to afford, watching the Hale family glide through the crowd like they'd been born in tuxedos and evening gowns. I grew up on job sites and in modest houses that shifted every few years, wherever my grandfather's next project took us, not in ballrooms with names on donation walls. Walter started Reed Properties swinging a hammer on other people's crews and sketching ideas in the margins of old invoices long before there was talk of resorts or foundations. When I was little, he'd pick me up from school in a dusty pickup truck and drive me past half-finished buildings telling stories about how you could turn an empty lot into something people would build their lives around. To me, that was wealth, the feeling of his hand on my shoulder as he pointed out a new roofline, the way he always bought extra sandwiches just in case someone on site forgot lunch. Money was there, sure, but it came wrapped in calloused palms and worn-out boots, not cufflinks and monograms. That's the world my sister and I came from, even if somewhere along the way we started walking very different paths. Jessica had always had a shine to her that people noticed before she even said a word, the kind of easy beauty that made teachers smile and strangers lean in. Growing up, she talked about big cities and better schools, about leaving behind the noise of construction yards for quiet libraries and polished floors. When she moved to New York after college and landed a job at a marketing firm, it felt like she'd stepped into the life she'd always pictured, with skyline views and rooftop cocktails instead of coffee and paper cups on a folding chair. I stayed closer to home, working in my grandfather's office, filing contracts and answering calls, learning how loans and permits and partnerships really worked. It wasn't glamorous, but it made sense to me, and it let me see the side of Walter. Most people missed the man who read every vendor agreement himself and still sent handwritten notes to the gardeners who kept his properties alive. When Jessica met Brandon Hale at a fundraiser in the city, the shift was almost immediate, like someone had turned a dial up on everything in her life. Suddenly my phone calls went to voicemail more often, and her stories were filled with family names I recognized from hospital wings and museum plaques. The Hales had heritage, as people like to say, money that went back generations, and a way of moving through the world that implied everything would always work out in their favor. When she brought Brandon home the first time, Walter shook his hand with the same polite firmness he offered to every contractor and banker. But I saw the way he watched my sister searching her face for something he couldn't quite name. She sat straighter at dinner that night, correcting little things about our speech and table manners, laughing a bit too loudly at jokes that weren't very funny. It was the first time I felt like a guest at my own family's table. As the wedding planning took over the next year, Reed Crest turned from just another successful property into Jessica's dream stage. I helped Walter sort stacks of paperwork in his study venue reservations, catering agreements, floral orders, lighting music, all of it running through the Reed Foundation as a gift he never once bragged about. He'd slide a contract across the desk and say, "Check that clause for me, kiddo," while his old watch ticked softly on his wrist, the same watch he'd worn back when he was patching drywall himself. When I suggested maybe Jessica and Brandon should contribute something, just a symbolic piece, he smiled and said, "Let her have the magic without the math for one day." He meant it too. He wanted her to have the kind of wedding his late wife once dreamed of back when they couldn't even afford a decent suit. I don't think it ever crossed his mind that she might not want anyone to know the magic had come from him. The day of the ceremony, I arrived early enough to see both worlds collide in one hallway. On one side, the Hale family's guests arrived in black cars, men in tailored tuxedos, and women in gowns that caught the light with every step, their laughter echoing against marble and glass. On the other, the staff Walter had employed for years moved with practiced grace, setting out place cards and linens, checking microphones, adjusting the angle of the chairs, so every guest had a perfect view. My grandfather chose a seat near the back so he wouldn't be in the way, as he put it, smoothing his old gray jacket and straightening the tie he preferred over anything new. When he caught my eye, he gave me that soft, reassuring nod, the one that always said, "I'm fine, don't fuss." I believed him, or I tried to, even as I saw the Hale cousins glance at him, then at the Reed name carved over the ballroom doors, their expressions caught somewhere between confusion and mild disapproval. By the time the music swelled and the doors opened for Jessica to walk down the aisle, the air in the room felt almost too bright, like the light itself had sharpened. Guests rose in unison, phones and cameras lifted a sea of faces turned toward my sister in her white lace gown as she floated past the rows of chairs. She kept her chin lifted, her gaze fixed on Brandon waiting under the arch of flowers, but as she drew closer to the back row, I saw her glance toward my grandfather. Walter pushed himself up, his hands braced on the edges of his chair, a smile already forming, ready to greet her, the way he had promised her years ago when she ran through the dusty halls of an unfinished hotel and declared she'd be a bride there someday. In that heartbeat, with the music swelling and everyone watching, I thought I knew exactly how that moment would go. I didn't realize until she opened her mouth that the first crack in the night was about to appear, and it would cut straight through the man who had built the ground beneath our feet. When Jessica reached the back row, her dress brushing lightly against the aisle runner, my grandfather lifted his hand as if he were greeting her on a quiet Sunday morning. She paused just long enough to meet his eyes, and in that brief moment, I waited for her to smile or whisper his name, anything that showed she saw him standing there. Instead, she turned toward the guests behind him with a poised, practiced expression and said, "Oh, sir, I think your seat is over there, pointing toward a row reserved for staff." A few people chuckled under their breath, mistaking her tone as light-hearted, and the Hales looked on with faint amusement, as if correcting an employee added charm to the ceremony. My grandfather lowered his hand, nodded politely, and eased back into his chair, while the music swelled to cover the small shift in the room's air. As Jessica continued her walk toward the arch, I felt the hush settle around us like a thin layer of frost. My grandfather sat quietly, his back straight, his palms resting on his knees, as if he were listening to a familiar tune. I slid into the seat beside him, aware of how out of place he looked among rows of tailored tuxedos and designer gowns. His suit was the same dark gray one he had worn to my high school graduation, still carrying that faint scent of cedar from his old wardrobe. A couple sitting nearby exchanged a glance, and the woman leaned toward her husband with a whisper that barely slipped past her lips, something about staff mixing in by mistake. He didn't acknowledge it, and I didn't interrupt them, though the words hung in the air like dust that refused to settle. When the ceremony ended, and the guests slowly filtered into the reception hall, the shift in atmosphere became more noticeable. Silver trays floated past us, carrying champagne flutes that sparkled beneath the lights, and servers wove between the guests with quiet efficiency. The Hale family moved through the room like they'd stepped off a magazine cover greeting visitors with measured charm. My grandfather walked with measured steps toward the main table where Jessica and Brandon accepted congratulations from a line of guests. He waited beside me, his hands folded behind his back, and when there was a brief pause, he reached forward and said softly, "You look just like your grandmother today." Jessica hesitated, glancing toward Brandon, before turning back to him with a guarded smile. "Oh, sir, you must have mistaken me for someone else." She answered, her tone light but distant. The chuckle that passed through the nearby guests cut deeper than any shout could have. Brandon's father lifted an eyebrow, looking my grandfather up and down, before offering a stiff, polite laugh, as if the encounter were little more than a mild inconvenience. My grandfather nodded again, the motion small and deliberate, then stepped back to give another guest room to greet the couple. For a moment, I watched Jessica's smile freeze slightly at the edges, but she turned back to the crowd as if nothing unusual had happened. I walked with him toward his table, tucked near a pillar at the room's edge. A place card had been set out for him in a font so small I had to lean close to read it. His table mates were strangers, guests of guests, casual acquaintances who didn't seem certain of where they should sit. A catering station stood only a few steps behind the chair assigned to him, and servers rotated trays in and out of the nearby doorway. He pulled out the chair and lowered himself onto it without complaint, adjusting his napkin neatly across his lap as the lights dimmed for the first toast. The sound of crystal being tapped echoed gently across the room as Charles Hale stood, his smile wide and sure. He welcomed everyone with the warm confidence of a man used to being listened to, praising the families who had come together for the occasion. He spoke of elegance heritage and the kind of refinement one hopes to pass on to the next generation. When he gestured toward Jessica, the applause was immediate and full. When he mentioned humble beginnings as something one might overcome with proper guidance, the applause grew even louder, rippling across the room in a way that left my grandfather's quiet corner dimmer than before. As the guests began to eat, the conversations shifted to lighter subjects, but now and then I caught the subtle glances directed toward my grandfather. A few people tilted their heads, recognizing the Reed name from the property's signage, yet unable to place the man who carried it. Others made polite nods in his direction, but then turned back to their tables to comment on the wine or the floral arrangements. A woman wearing a thick diamond necklace leaned toward her companion and wondered aloud whether the staff had been given new uniforms, her eyes drifting toward my grandfather's jacket as she spoke. Jessica passed by our table as the photographer guided her through the room for staged shots. As she paused near us, her eyes flicked briefly toward her place card at our table, then toward my grandfather's hands resting calmly near his plate. For a moment she looked as though she might speak, but the photographer touched her arm gently and asked for a picture near the entryway. She followed without looking back, her dress brushing the floor behind her. The dinner plates arrived, and my grandfather declined the wine that was poured automatically at every place setting. He asked the server for a glass of water instead, offering a small smile that the young woman returned before she moved on. Charles noticed and gave a short laugh from a few tables away, remarking to another guest about simple tastes. The comment wasn't loud, but in a room filled with quiet conversations, it slipped easily across the space between us. I leaned closer and whispered, "We can move to another table if you'd like." He shook his head gently. "I'm all right." He stayed quiet through most of the meal, listening to the music and watching the servers move through the room with the steady, rhythmic pace of people who knew every corner of the building by heart. The band shifted to a softer tune, and lights along the far wall glowed in warm gold as people drifted toward the dance floor. Jessica and Brandon stepped forward for their first dance, and the room circled around them with applause that washed over the space like a wave. My grandfather watched them dance with a look that held no tension, just steady observation. When the song ended and the crowd clapped again, he rested his hands on the tablecloth and took a long, quiet breath. The room gradually filled with conversations as people began returning to their seats, some brushing past our table without noticing him, others casting brief, uncertain glances his way. A few moments later, Linda Hale leaned toward her husband and murmured something quietly, her eyes directed toward my grandfather's corner. He responded with a slow nod before glancing toward Martin Keller, the general manager who stood near the doors coordinating a group of servers. Martin approached cautiously, his expression respectful but uncertain, and leaned down to speak to Charles. Their exchange was short, and Martin's face tightened ever so slightly before he stepped back. The music covered most of their words, but the tone of their voices was clear enough to understand that my grandfather's presence had somehow become a topic of discussion. My grandfather lifted his glass, taking a small sip of water, and set it down with that same careful calm he had carried all evening. He looked toward the head table where Jessica sat beside Brandon, her smile still bright beneath the lights. The room buzzed with laughter and small talk, but underneath it all, I felt a stillness gathering like a soft pressure in the air, something quiet but unmistakable. As the next course was served and conversations continued drifting around us, he folded his napkin neatly and rested his hands on the table, his gaze steady and thoughtful. Something in his posture shifted just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to understand something had changed. Whatever patience had carried him through the ceremony and dinner now settled into a quieter, deeper place. And as I watched him sit there under the soft glow of Reed Crest's chandeliers, I sensed the moment that would lead to everything that came next was already beginning to form. The evening settled into a soft hum as guests drifted back to their seats, the lights adjusting to a warm glow that softened the edges of the ballroom. My grandfather remained at his small table near the pillar still and composed his gaze steady on the space ahead of him. He held his water glass in both hands as if the simple act kept him grounded in the noise around us. The music shifted to a slower tune, while servers moved with practiced ease, collecting plates and replacing them with new ones. I sat beside him again, the chair legs scraping lightly across the marble, and I felt the steadiness of his posture, in contrast to the restless motion of the room. Near the head table, the Hale family was gathered in a loose semicircle, their voices low, but their expressions sharp enough to read from across the room. Linda held her napkin lightly in her hand, twisting the edge of the fabric while leaning toward her husband, her brows arched in a silent question. Charles gave a small shake of his head before turning his attention back to the dance floor, though every few seconds his eyes drifted toward our corner. Their glances lasted just long enough to make it clear that my grandfather's presence was becoming a topic of more than casual conversation. When the band began a lively song and guests moved onto the dance floor, I could feel a slight shift behind the politeness. A few people passed by our table with brief nods, but others kept their distance, as if our quiet corner had turned into a shadow on the bright celebration. A couple I hadn't met paused near the pillar to speak with friends at a nearby table, and one of them looked at my grandfather with a puzzled expression before whispering something behind her hand. The friend glanced toward the Reed name engraved above the ballroom's entrance and nodded as if she'd solved a small mystery, though her gaze still lingered on my grandfather's gray jacket. Servers continued weaving through the crowd, offering refills and replacing empty glasses. One young server paused beside our table with a tray of champagne. My grandfather smiled and thanked her, but asked for water again. She nodded and moved on, but not before glancing briefly at the place card with his name printed in small letters. It was a small detail, yet it seemed to echo the tone of the evening in a quiet way, hinting at how decisions had been made without much thought. I kept my voice low as I leaned toward him. "If you'd prefer a different seat, I can talk to Martin." He shook his head with a small motion. "This is fine." His tone wasn't dismissive or strained, just steady as though he had settled into the evening with a kind of acceptance that didn't require explanation. Still, the tension in the room pressed around our table like a gentle weight, not heavy enough to draw attention, but impossible to ignore. When the next toast was announced, the lights dimmed slightly, and guests returned to their seats. A few people murmured politely on their way past, complimenting the decor or the wine, but their smiles faded quickly once they reached their own tables. Jessica and Brandon sat together at the head table, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She looked toward us once her expression caught between uncertainty and something else she didn't quite reveal. Brandon leaned in close to speak to her, and she nodded slowly before lifting her champagne flute for the next toast. The toast itself was light-hearted, filled with stories of childhood friendships and college memories, but the laughter sounded different now, a bit more restrained and cautious. Even the band seemed to hesitate between songs, letting a longer pause settle before the next melody began. From our corner, I could see the way conversation shifted around us, people glancing toward my grandfather, as if trying to place a detail they couldn't quite identify. A woman at a nearby table leaned toward her husband, gesturing toward the floral arrangements with admiration. When her eyes drifted toward the carved reed crest emblem on the wall, her voice lowered slightly. "It's remarkable how much work must go into a place like this," she murmured. "I wonder who oversees everything." Her husband shrugged. "Probably someone connected to the foundation." She nodded, casting another quick glance toward my grandfather, unaware of how close she was to the answer. As the evening progressed, the air grew heavier with small signs that the atmosphere had shifted. A guest wearing a navy suit paused near our table, glancing at my grandfather for a moment longer than necessary before turning away. A group of younger guests walked past their conversation, trailing off into a quieter tone when they reached our corner. One of them looked back over his shoulder, whispering something to his companion that made her lift her eyebrows before they continued toward the bar. When the next course arrived, my grandfather ate slowly and with calm composure, though he took smaller bites than usual. His hands remained steady, his posture unchanging, and the expression on his face held a quiet patience that seemed to anchor him in the moment. He didn't rush, didn't shift in his chair, didn't seem unsettled by the glances that drifted toward him now and then. I tried to match his calm, but my attention kept drifting to the head table. Jessica's smile had grown tight at the edges, and she kept touching her necklace with small movements of her fingers. When she leaned toward Brandon, he nodded once, but kept his gaze fixed on the dance floor. Their exchange was brief, but enough to show she felt the weight pressing against her from both sides of the room. A few minutes later, Charles stood again and whispered something to Martin, who had returned to the doorway. Martin's expression shifted slightly, though he maintained the professional composure expected of him. After their brief exchange, he nodded and stepped back into the crowd, keeping a careful distance from the head table as he continued coordinating the staff. Somewhere nearby, a chair scraped sharply against the floor, catching the attention of several guests. It wasn't an unusual sound, yet the room's sensitivity made even minor noises feel amplified. My grandfather didn't look up, but he placed his fork down with a small, deliberate motion, as if sensing the shift around him. The quietness of our corner contrasted sharply with the rest of the room. At other tables, guests spoke in warm tones, exchanged stories, and laughed between sips of champagne. Their joy hovered easily above the linen tablecloths and candlelight, but that same ease didn't quite reach our side of the ballroom. Instead, we sat in a space filled with quiet pauses, glances that lingered too long, and a sense of distance that grew with each passing moment. I tried to offer conversation something light enough to break the stillness, but my grandfather simply smiled and gave a small shake of his head, letting the silence settle between us. It wasn't uncomfortable silence, but it carried a weight that didn't need words to explain itself. He rested his hands on the tablecloth again, that familiar calm guiding his posture in a way that told me he had reached a quiet decision long before the evening began. The band began another song, its gentle melody floating across the room as servers cleared plates and refilled glasses. Guests leaned close to one another, their voices soft beneath the music, and for a brief moment, the room felt almost peaceful. Yet beneath that calm, I sensed something gathering the way a room can shift before a door opens or a conversation changes course. My grandfather looked toward the head table one last time, his face serene, his expression unreadable. Then he lifted his water glass and set it down with a steady motion that seemed to echo across the table, even though the sound itself was faint. It was in that small gesture, simple and quiet, that I understood something was shifting beneath the surface of the evening, something that would no longer be held back by polite smiles or dimmed lights. And as the song drew to a gentle close and the room settled again, I felt the unmistakable sense that the next moment would change everything. My grandfather set his water glass down with a slow motion that seemed to settle the air around us. The musicians finished their song, letting the last notes fade gently over the room. Conversations dimmed and picked up again, but something beneath the surface felt different, as if the room itself were waiting for the next move. He eased his hands onto the table, his fingers relaxed and steady, then shifted his weight as though preparing to stand. I watched the small change in posture, the way someone might notice a curtain pull back before a play begins, subtle yet unmistakable. When he pushed his chair back, the sound carried farther than it should have. It wasn't loud, but it reached more ears than expected, and a few heads turned instinctively toward our corner. My grandfather rose slowly, smoothing the front of his jacket with that familiar practiced motion. His shoulders lifted not with tension, but with the quiet purpose of someone who had made up his mind long before the moment arrived. I rose partway with him, unsure of whether to follow, but he gave a brief shake of his head. "Stay," he murmured, his voice soft enough that only I could hear. As he stepped into the aisle between the tables, the lighting shifted just slightly, catching the silver in his hair and the lines at the corners of his eyes. His steps were measured the same steady pace he used whenever he walked through construction sites years ago, inspecting beams and foundations while talking with workers. The guests closest to him paused mid-conversation, their attention drawn more by instinct than curiosity. A server carrying a tray of pastries slowed, stepping aside with a quiet nod as he passed. The path to the stage wasn't long, but it carried him directly through the center of the room. Each table he passed grew quieter voices, tapering off as people took notice of the older man, moving with such calm intention. Linda Hale's eyes widened as she caught sight of him approaching the front. She leaned toward Charles and whispered something quickly, but he had already turned to watch. Brandon straightened in his seat, and Jessica's hand froze on the stem of her champagne flute. My grandfather reached the edge of the small platform where earlier speakers had stood. Charles stepped forward slightly, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Reed, if you need something, I can have someone assist you," he said, his tone warm but edged with caution. My grandfather paused at the foot of the stage and looked up at him with an expression that was gentle, almost reflective. "I appreciate that," he said quietly, "but I think I can manage." He stepped onto the platform with the kind of steadiness that comes from years of navigating unsteady ground. Once he reached the microphone, he didn't touch it right away. Instead, he took a moment to look across the room, his gaze moving over the rows of tables, the floral arrangements and the soft lights reflecting off crystal and glass. The room settled into a near silence, not because anyone had called for attention, but because something in his presence drew it naturally. I moved closer to the aisle to see better, careful not to disturb the guests around me. The musicians lowered their instruments slightly, waiting. Even the servers paused near the walls, trays held steady in mid-flight. Jessica's eyes were fixed on him now, her expression caught between confusion and a deeper, quieter concern. Brandon leaned in and whispered something to her, but she didn't move. Her gaze stayed on our grandfather, the man who had walked her through unfinished hallways when she was still small enough to ride on his shoulders. My grandfather rested his hands lightly on the podium, though he didn't lean his weight on it. He looked at Jessica, first holding her gaze for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he turned to the guests, his voice steady when he began to speak. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate with our families," he said, each word clear and calm. A few guests glanced at each other, unsure of whether this was planned. The band leader at the edge of the stage stepped back slightly, giving the space to him. He continued, "I've had the privilege of watching this resort grow from the first drawings on my desk to the place it is tonight. Many hands built it, and many hearts have cared for it along the way." His tone held no strain, no frustration, just a quiet sincerity that made the room lean in. Jessica's posture softened a bit, the tension in her shoulders easing, though her expression remained uncertain. Brandon shifted slightly, his jaw tightening as he glanced toward his parents. My grandfather reached into his jacket and withdrew a small leather folder, the same deep brown one he used for contracts and proposals throughout the years. He placed it gently on the podium and let his hand rest on it for a moment. Then he looked at the guests again with a steady, unbroken gaze. "Weddings are often seen as new beginnings," he said, "and tonight certainly reflects that in many ways." He paused, letting his eyes move across the room once more, stopping briefly on faces he recognized from business meetings, social events, and years of work woven through the tapestry of Reed Properties. But beginnings come with responsibilities. They rely on honesty, on understanding where we come from, and on valuing the people who built the path beneath our feet. A few guests fidgeted in their seats, unsure where the speech was leading. Charles shifted his stance, his smile tightening, as he looked from the audience back to my grandfather. Linda reached for her husband's hand beneath the table, her expression stiff and composed. I stood near the aisle, my breath catching slightly as I recognized the tone in my grandfather's voice. It wasn't anger or confrontation. It was the same tone he used when explaining the importance of blueprints to new project managers or when guiding a team through structural choices. It was the voice of someone who believed every word mattered. He lifted the folder and opened it with a deliberate motion. The sound of the hinge snapping back seemed louder than it should have been. "This," he said, "softly contains the agreements that brought tonight to life. The venue, the arrangements, the work behind every detail you see." Guests exchanged uncertain looks now, and Jessica's hand moved to her necklace, her fingers brushing lightly across the clasp. My grandfather closed the folder, but kept one hand resting on it. There is a time to celebrate, and a time to acknowledge the truth of things he said, and I have learned that the moments when both require attention often reveal themselves at unexpected times. From across the room I saw Martin watching from near the wall, his expression steady but attentive. The servers near him had paused fully, now waiting. My grandfather let out a slow breath. "I won't keep you long," he said, his tone warm yet unmistakably firm. "But there are things that should be understood before this evening goes much further." Jessica stood up slightly from her chair, her hands pressing against the tablecloth before she eased back into her seat again. Brandon leaned toward her, but she didn't look away from our grandfather. My grandfather looked at the guests one more time, his eyes calm and clear, and then he lifted the leather folder with both hands, holding it gently as though it were something fragile. "We all choose the paths we walk," he said. "And tonight, the path ahead depends on recognizing the one behind us." The room remained silent, waiting for the next words, the next shift. Even the chandeliers seemed to hold their glow a little more tightly. And as he rested the folder back on the podium with a quiet final touch, I knew the moment he was preparing for was arriving, steady and undeniable, shaping the next turn of the evening with a clarity no one in the room could ignore. My grandfather let his hand rest on the folder, and for a moment he simply stood there, beneath the soft light, allowing the room's quiet to settle again. No one spoke, and even the band waited with their instruments lowered. It was the kind of pause that seemed to draw the air closer, as if every person in the room leaned forward without moving. The chandeliers shimmered against the glasses on every table, yet the only sound was the faint hum of the ventilation system high above us. He lifted the folder and placed it on the edge of the podium. "These agreements represent months of preparation," he said calmly. "Every detail of tonight, from the halls you walked through to the garden outside, was arranged through a partnership that has guided this place from its very beginning." His voice carried clearly, not through force, but through the quiet steadiness of his tone. Around the room, guests exchanged uncertain glances, each of them realizing this wasn't an ordinary toast. Charles stepped forward again, offering a small laugh that sounded rehearsed. "Mr. Reed, perhaps we should let the band begin the next song before we lose the energy in the room," he said, glancing toward the crowd, as if to draw them back into lighter conversation. My grandfather looked at him with a patient expression. "I won't be long," he said, "but clarity is important." He opened the folder and removed a few sheets of paper, holding them with a care that made it clear these were not props. He set them on the podium, aligning the corners with deliberate precision. Jessica's eyes widened when she recognized the format of the documents, and her hand gripped the edge of the tablecloth lightly. Brandon leaned closer to read her expression, but she kept her gaze on our grandfather. "These documents," he continued, outline the agreements between Reed Properties and the vendors who made this night possible. He nodded toward the floral arrangements, then toward the chandeliers that cast soft patterns across the walls. "Every contract lists the Reed Foundation as the coordinating party. Every deposit was made through us, and every detail was approved by our team." A ripple moved through the crowd, subtle but unmistakable. Some guests tilted their heads, trying to understand why the information mattered. Others stiffened, recognizing the tone of someone laying out the groundwork for something larger. My grandfather turned another page and placed it beside the first. "I don't share this to boast," he said. "I share it because it matters to understand the foundation beneath this celebration." Charles's smile faded slightly and he stepped closer with a low voice that carried farther than he intended. "Mr. Reed, this isn't the time for business." My grandfather held his gaze. "Business is built on truth," he said softly, "and so are families." Jessica's posture shifted, a slight inhale of breath showing across her shoulders. Her fingers loosened their grip on the tablecloth, only to tighten again, as if she couldn't decide whether to rise or stay seated. Brandon reached for her hand, but she didn't respond. My grandfather continued, "When I built this resort, I wanted it to be a place where families could gather without needing to think about anything but the joy of the moment. I never expected the place itself to become part of a lesson." Linda's hand went to her necklace, her expression tightening with a mix of apprehension and impatience. A few guests near her exchanged glances, recognizing that the gentle tone my grandfather used wasn't meant to soften a celebration. He was introducing a change in the evening's direction. He touched the stack of documents lightly. "These agreements represent more than numbers and signatures. They represent the values that shaped this place, respect for the work behind what you see, and acknowledgement for the hands that built it." His gaze moved slowly across the room, not accusing, simply observing. And sometimes, he said, "we forget the people who carried us forward." Jessica lowered her eyes, her features softening as if a realization pressed gently against her. Brandon shifted in his seat, clearly unsure of how to respond. A few rows back, a woman held her breath, the tension in the air almost visible. My grandfather closed the folder again, his fingers pressing the leather gently as though concluding a chapter. "I am grateful to each of you for celebrating with us," he said. "But gratitude isn't complete without truth, and tonight the truth is necessary." He stepped slightly to the side of the podium, allowing the microphone to catch his voice without amplification. "This celebration stands on the shoulders of many people," he said. "And before we go any further, it's important to recognize where those shoulders stand." The bandleader glanced toward Martin, who stood by the doorway with his arms loosely at his sides, watching the scene unfold. A few servers had paused fully now, trays resting against their palms in silence. My grandfather looked at Jessica again, his expression neither firm nor soft, simply full of meaning. "We all choose how we move through the world," he said. "And sometimes those choices lead us farther from where we began than we ever expected." Jessica's breath caught her shoulders, drawing back slightly, as though she were preparing herself for something she sensed but couldn't yet name. "What matters now," my grandfather said, "is understanding the space between where we stand and where we started. That space tells a story." He took one small step back from the podium, and it felt as if the entire room leaned toward him without realizing it. "And that story," he said quietly, "is why I needed to speak tonight." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the chandeliers seemed to hold their light, more still than before. Jessica raised her eyes to him slowly, her expression changing in a way that made the evening's earlier moments feel like distant echoes. My grandfather rested one hand on the podium again, grounding himself before the next words that waited just ahead. And in the stillness of that moment, I could feel the room bracing for the shift about to come, the kind that doesn't just change a celebration, it changes the course of everything built around it. My grandfather stood with his hand resting on the folder, the soft glow from the chandeliers settling around him like a quiet frame. No one moved, and even the hum of the air felt muted under the weight of the moment. He looked across the room with a calm that didn't strain or falter, and then he drew a small breath, lifting the microphone with a steady hand. His voice carried easily, not loud, but shaped with the kind of certainty that made people listen. "I'd like to share something before we go on," he said. "It won't take long." Jessica shifted in her seat, gripping the edge of her napkin. The soft fabric slipped between her fingers as she lifted her eyes, her face captured between fear and hope. Brandon rested one hand lightly on the back of her chair without taking his eyes off my grandfather. My grandfather opened the folder again and removed a single page, setting it on top of the others. "This," he said, Tapping the page with his fingertip is the summary of tonight's expenditures, the venue, the vendors, the staff, and the arrangements that made this evening what it is. Charles's smile tightened quickly, and he stepped closer. "Mr. Reed, we don't need to involve the guests in— My intent," my grandfather said gently, "is simply to clarify the foundation of tonight's celebration." He slid the top page slightly forward so the guests closest to the stage could see the letterhead from Reed Properties Group. "These arrangements came to just over $1 billion, he said, a figure built through years of partnerships, investments, and the work of the people who shaped these grounds." A ripple of shocked air moved through the room, soft but unmistakable. Some guests straightened in their chairs, while others glanced at each other with raised brows. Even the servers paused mid-step near the wall, unsure whether to move or stay still. My grandfather continued, "I share this not to call attention to myself, but because I believe truth brings clarity, and clarity is important when we gather as families." Jessica's breath caught her hand trembling slightly as she placed it in her lap. Brandon watched her carefully, his jaw setting with a tension he didn't bother to hide. My grandfather looked down at the papers again, his gaze softening before he lifted his eyes. "These decisions were made with joy," he said. "Joy for the couple, for our families, and for the new path ahead. Every detail was chosen with care and with the hope that it would bring happiness." He turned the page gently, placing it back under the others. "But happiness also asks for honesty," he said quietly, "and honesty requires us to acknowledge one another fully." Only the soft crackle of the candles along the wall filled the space between his words. My grandfather's gaze landed on Jessica with a softness that held years of memories. "I've loved watching you grow," he said. "I've seen your strength, your dreams, and your drive. I've been honored to stand beside you at moments that shaped your life." Jessica's eyes glistened, her shoulders pulling inward as though bracing against the emotional weight she had tried to avoid all evening. But tonight, he said, I was reminded that the journey forward only works when we recognize where we came from. Charles stepped forward again, his voice sharp now. "Are you implying that our family—" "My remarks concern my own family," my grandfather said, steady and calm, "and the choices made tonight." The guests grew still again, waiting. My grandfather's voice softened. "I didn't wish to interrupt the evening. I didn't intend to become the center of attention, but I believe an evening grounded in celebration should also be grounded in truth." He rested the folder on the podium and placed his hand on it one last time. "And the truth is simple," he said. "I cannot celebrate among guests who were asked to believe I am someone I am not." A quiet gasp escaped from somewhere near the back of the room. Jessica rose halfway out of her chair, her breath uneven. "Grandpa, please," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Let's just talk later." He looked at her gently. "Later is built on now," he said, "and now needs clarity." He picked up the folder, closed it carefully, and stepped away from the podium. His steps were slow but certain as he moved toward the edge of the stage. He paused there, turning back to the guests with a polite nod. "Thank you for listening," he said. "I wish you all a pleasant evening." Before anyone could respond, he stepped off the platform and moved through the aisle toward the exit. The room's hush followed him like a trailing breeze, and even the music stopped mid-note to make space for his steps. Jessica pushed back her chair abruptly, the legs scraping the floor. She took a few quick steps toward him before stopping short. Her hands clenched at her sides. She looked around the room, her face streaked with confusion, hurt, and uncertainty, as the guests whispered among themselves. Brandon rose beside her, tension visible in his shoulders. "Jess, what was that?" he asked, his voice low but pointed. "I don't know," she whispered, shaking her head. "I didn't think he would." "You didn't think he pressed his eyes sharp, as if the speech had knocked loose some assumption he'd carried about the evening?" Jessica took a slow breath, her gaze shifting back toward the doors where my grandfather had disappeared. "I swear I didn't expect this," she said, her voice cracking. "I thought it was handled." Linda leaned toward them from across the table, her expression drawn tight. "We can't let this overshadow the evening," she murmured. "People are watching." Jessica's hands trembled as she backed into her chair, sinking onto the edge of it. She touched her wedding band as though trying to find her balance again, her eyes unfocused for a moment, before she lifted them toward me. The look she gave me was one I hadn't seen before, uncertain, lost almost childlike in its vulnerability. Servers remained frozen near the walls, unsure whether the event was still in motion. Guests whispered in small clusters, trying to piece together what they had seen. Brandon stared at the documents left on the podium, the Reed Properties letterhead, clear even from several tables away. I moved slowly toward Jessica's table, reaching her side just as she wiped a hand across her cheek. "Rachel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." I studied her face, the struggle, the weight of choices made quietly behind the scenes, and the growing understanding that her decisions carried consequences she hadn't prepared for. "He didn't want to hurt you," I said softly, "but he needed you to see him." She closed her eyes for a moment, her breath unsteady. "I saw him," she whispered. I wasn't ready for everyone else to see him too." The orchestra remained silent, the musicians watching carefully for direction. Martin stepped toward the conductor and spoke in a low voice, then stepped back again, waiting for guidance. Jessica opened her eyes, scanning the room with a look that carried a mix of longing and regret. "I don't know how to fix this," she said. Her words rested heavily in the quiet that surrounded us. The ballroom had changed. It wasn't broken, not yet, but the sparkle had dimmed into something muted, something waiting. Conversations continued in hushed tones, and the lights felt a little softer than before. I placed a hand gently on Jessica's shoulder. "This isn't the end," I said quietly, "but the next steps matter." Her fingers tightened around mine with a small, fragile grip. "I know," she said. Somewhere beyond the glass doors, my grandfather stepped into the night air, carrying the calm that had guided him through every corner of his life. And as the room braced itself for what the evening would become, I felt the shift settling into place, the moment where everything ahead would hinge on the choices about to unfold. For a long moment after my grandfather left the ballroom, no one moved. Jessica stood near the aisle where she had stopped short, her hands clasped in front of her, as if she weren't sure whether to sit or walk out the door after him. Guests murmured in short, clipped tones, glancing from the podium to the couple's table with growing unease. The band remained still at the edge of the stage, their instruments resting in their laps as they waited for some kind of cue that never came. Jessica sank slowly back into her chair, her shoulders rounded as if the weight of everything she had tried to control was finally settling on her. Brandon sat beside her with his arms crossed, watching her wrestle with emotions he didn't seem certain how to approach. Charles paced a tight circle near the head table, while Linda held her napkin in both hands, folding and unfolding the corners in silence. On the far side of the room, a few servers began quietly collecting empty glasses, hesitant in their movements, as if they weren't sure whether their work was still welcome. The soft clink of crystal against silver trays echoed unnervingly through the hall, filling the spaces where music should have played. I moved to Jessica's side and eased into the chair next to her. She didn't look at me at first. Her gaze stayed fixed on the doorway, where our grandfather had walked out. Her voice, when it finally surfaced, drifted barely above a whisper. I didn't know he would do that. I reached for her hand on the table, but she didn't clasp mine right away. "He didn't do it to ruin the night," I said gently. He needed to say the truth out loud. A tear slipped down her cheek and she brushed it away quickly, lowering her head. "I just wanted things to go smoothly," she said. "I didn't want people asking questions I wasn't ready to answer." Brandon leaned forward, his tone measured but heavy. "Your grandfather didn't embarrass anyone, Jess, but you kept information from me, from us." His eyes darkened slightly as he looked at the documents still sitting on the podium. "And that makes it hard to know what to trust." She straightened with a slow breath and turned to him. "I didn't hide anything to hurt you. He raised a hand, stopping her gently. "I'm trying to understand," he said. "But you put me in a difficult position in front of my entire family." The strain in his voice made her swallow hard. She looked back at me as if hoping I could interpret something in his words that she couldn't face alone. I gave her hand a soft squeeze. "The moment changed," I said. "But that doesn't mean it can't be repaired." Jessica nodded as though trying to accept the possibility, though her eyes showed she was standing on unsteady ground. Across the room, Charles approached the podium. He picked up the leather folder as if searching for answers on the pages inside. His face tensed when he saw the figures at the top of the summary sheet, and he turned sharply toward the entrance, his steps clipped and controlled. "We need a private discussion," he said to Brandon, motioning toward a side hallway. Brandon looked at Jessica, then at me. "I'll be right back," he said, before following his father. Jessica watched him go, the distance between them stretching wider than the aisle he crossed. She exhaled slowly, her hands trembling as she clasped them in her lap. "Everything feels like it's slipping," she whispered. I placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Then hold on to what matters," I said, "and start with honesty. That's what he was asking for." Her breath wavered again, but she nodded. Near the entrance, a few guests began gathering their coats and shawls, unsure whether the evening had ended or simply paused. Their conversations drifted around the room in quiet threads, many of them speaking of the man who had walked out so calmly, leaving the entire event in silence. Others whispered about the contracts, the cost, and what it meant for the Hales' carefully sculpted image. The photographer lowered his camera and slipped it into its case, his expression cautious as he moved toward the exit. The florist's assistant, someone I recognized from earlier in the day, stood near the table arrangements, waiting for direction from her supervisor. Even Martin seemed uncertain as he stepped lightly toward the conductor and spoke in a low, steady voice. Jessica finally rose, steadying herself with one hand on the table. "I should find him," she said. "I need to explain." I stood with her. "Let's step outside. You can decide what to do once you've taken a moment." We walked through the ballroom's double doors and into the hallway where the quieter lighting eased some of the strain from her features. She paused near the windows that overlooked the courtyard, her reflection soft in the glass. "I never wanted to deny him," she said, her voice low. "I just didn't want people making assumptions before they knew me." She shook her head, her eyes drifting to the ground. "I didn't think it mattered if I waited. It mattered to him," I said gently, "and it mattered to you more than you realized." She breathed in slowly. "He was always there for us," she said. "He showed up to everything. He didn't miss a thing." As she spoke, her eyes filled again, not from shock this time, but from recognition. She leaned against the window ledge, her fingers pressing lightly into the wood. "I built a life that looked impressive," she said, "but I don't know that I built one he would recognize." She lowered her head, letting the truth sit with her fully for the first time. The hallway quiet opened around us. Through the glass doors at the far end of the corridor, we could see the courtyard framed in soft evening light. Lanterns hung from the branches of the maple trees outside, and the stone path leading toward the parking area glowed under the small lights that lined it. Jessica straightened and wiped her cheeks. "If I start repairing this," she said carefully, "I want to do it the right way, not because people are watching or because my reputation feels shaky." I nodded. "That's the only way it works." She looked toward the courtyard again, her eyes focused on the path ahead. "I want him to see I'm trying," she said. "Not with a speech in front of guests, not with excuses, just through actions." A group of guests passed by, their voices becoming soft echoes as they walked toward the parking lot. Jessica waited until they were out of earshot before she spoke again. "I think I'm ready," she said, her voice steadier now. "I'm not sure what I'll say, but I want to find him." I placed my hand on her arm. "Then let's go." She shook her head. "I need to go alone." I hesitated, then nodded. "I'll be here when you return." She stepped away, taking slow, deliberate steps toward the courtyard doors. Her figure reflected lightly in the glass as she pushed them open. The lantern light washed over her as she walked down the path, moving with a mix of determination and quiet humility. I watched her until she reached the edge of the courtyard and disappeared around a corner that led toward the estate grounds. The gentle rustle of leaves in the evening breeze filled the silence she left behind. A moment later, I turned toward the ballroom doors, feeling the shift that had begun inside and watching the path Jessica had taken dissolve into the night. Ahead lay the beginning of something different, something earned. Jessica disappeared down the courtyard path, and I stayed near the window for a while, watching the lantern light shift across the stone. The The ballroom behind me had settled into a muted hush, the kind that follows after something too large to ignore. When I finally stepped outside, the night air felt crisp against my skin, carrying the faint scent of the vineyard soil and the soft rustle of leaves overhead. I could see her in the distance, standing near the small bench my grandfather liked to rest on during long days at the estate. She kept her back straight, her hands clasped in front of her as she waited for him to turn toward her. By the time I reached the edge of the walk, he was already seated, his shoulders angled slightly as he listened to her speak. Her voice was low-shaped by pauses that stretched gently between her words, and he didn't interrupt. He simply kept his gaze on the ground for a moment, then looked up at her with that familiar steadiness. I couldn't hear what she said from where I stood, but I saw the change in her posture as the tension eased from her shoulders. He nodded once, then again, and after a long silence he reached out and touched her hand. It wasn't dramatic, just a small, quiet gesture that seemed to close the distance between them in a way nothing else could. I waited until Jessica turned back toward the path, her steps slower now but more grounded. She didn't wipe her face or hurriedly compose herself. She just walked with the kind of calm that comes after speaking a truth that needed to be said. When she reached me, she offered a tired smile, the first real one I'd seen from her all night. "We talked," she said softly. "He asked me to come by the house this week. He wants me to help with one of the foundation projects." Her breath steadied as she added, "I said yes." We headed back toward the resort together, and inside the ballroom a few guests were gathering their belongings. Some nodded politely as they passed us, their voices quiet but not unkind. The musicians packed away their instruments, and Martin gave me a brief nod as he oversaw the staff clearing the tables. Jessica and Brandon exchanged a few quiet words near the dance floor, and although I didn't hear what he said, I saw his expression soften. He took her hand with a tentative acceptance that signaled the beginning of their own necessary conversations. In the days that followed, the story reached further than any of us expected. Articles appeared with headlines that focused on my grandfather's calm presence and the sudden shift in the evening, but he declined every request for interviews. He spent most mornings on the porch sipping coffee while looking out over the rows of vines that had shaped so much of his life's work. When I asked him how he felt about the attention, he simply smiled and said he was more interested in the work that still needed to be done. Jessica started spending her afternoons at the Foundation's local office, learning how projects were planned and how resources were managed for families who needed help. Her wardrobe changed to comfortable clothes and practical shoes, and she drove herself to work each day without the chauffeur the Hales had offered. She took notes during meetings, asked questions, and listened more than she spoke. Over time, the staff began to greet her with familiarity rather than caution, and she returned their kindness with steady effort. One afternoon, I visited a community site where volunteers were repairing a row of small homes affected by winter storms. I found Jessica kneeling beside an older woman, helping her carry a box of supplies. She stood up when she saw me and brushed a bit of dust from her jeans. "I'm learning," she said with a quiet pride. I needed to. Later that evening, my grandfather joined us for dinner at the Foundation's modest event hall, where families and volunteers gathered for an annual appreciation meal. There were no chandeliers or elaborate arrangements, just simple lights strung overhead and tables filled with people who had worked hard to uplift one another. When he rose to speak, he didn't mention the wedding or the public reaction. Instead, he talked about the power of earning trust and the way dignity often grows in the spaces where no one is watching. His words were met with warm applause, the kind that comes from understanding rather than spectacle. Jessica sat beside me, her eyes bright with a mix of gratitude and humility. When our grandfather looked toward her near the end of his remarks, she placed a hand over her heart, a quiet acknowledgement of the bridge they had begun to rebuild. By the time the meal ended, she had spoken with nearly every person in the room, listening to their stories and asking how she could help in the coming months. As we walked out into the cool evening air, she slipped her arm gently through mine. "I know I can't erase what happened," she said, "but I can build something better going forward. That's all any of us can do," I said. She nodded, letting the night breeze move through her hair as she looked toward the path ahead. The lights from the hall glowed softly behind us, casting long shadows that blended into the quiet hum of the surrounding neighborhood. Life rarely moves in straight lines. It curves and twists, and sometimes it brings moments that force us to look closely at who we've become. But those moments can also open the door to truth, forgiveness, and the strength to grow in ways we didn't expect. Watching Jessica walk beside our grandfather in the weeks that followed reminded me that grace can be found in the steps we take after everything falls quiet. Thank you for listening to our story. If it touched something in your heart, feel free to share your thoughts or subscribe for more stories like this. And wherever you are, may your own path be shaped by kindness and the courage to begin again.